The most dangerous person in a courtroom is not the one who speaks first, but the one who has already decided exactly when to speak. The marble courthouse in Lower Manhattan stood beneath a gray autumn sky as television vans lined the sidewalk and reporters gathered behind polished metal barricades, eager to witness what many news outlets had already labeled the billionaire divorce of the year. Cameras flashed without pause while journalists repeated familiar headlines about Alexander Hayes, the celebrated founder of Hayes Global Holdings, and the quiet wife who had supposedly refused to fight for her marriage. Every legal analyst predicted the same outcome before the courtroom doors even opened. Grace Hayes would walk away with dignity, Alexander would walk away with freedom, and the glamorous woman who had spent months appearing beside him at charity galas and executive dinners would finally step into the life she believed had always been waiting for her. Inside courtroom 12, polished oak benches filled quickly with attorneys, business reporters, curious spectators, and several executives from Hayes Global Holdings who watched in uneasy silence. The atmosphere felt strangely calm despite the enormous financial stakes resting beneath the surface. At the plaintiff's table sat Alexander Hayes wearing a tailored charcoal suit that reflected years of confidence built through billion-dollar negotiations. His expression remained composed, although the quiet tension in his jaw suggested this was not another business meeting he could control. Beside him sat Sophia Bennett, elegantly dressed in cream and gold, carrying herself with unmistakable confidence. She smiled politely whenever photographers outside the courtroom came to mind, convinced that today's proceedings would finally erase every whispered rumor and replace them with official recognition. Across the aisle, Grace Hayes sat completely alone. She wore a simple navy dress beneath a light beige coat, her blonde hair neatly arranged, her wedding ring still resting on her left hand. No expensive jewelry demanded attention. No stack of legal binders covered her table. No attorney occupied the empty chair beside her. She quietly folded her hands and looked toward the judge's bench with the same calm expression she might have worn while reading a book in a quiet library. Several spectators exchanged puzzled glances. One reporter whispered that perhaps she could no longer afford proper legal representation. Another suggested she had simply accepted defeat. Neither possibility reflected the truth, but Grace made no effort to correct either assumption. The bailiff announced the court's arrival, and everyone rose as Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered the courtroom with measured authority. After everyone returned to their seats, routine procedural matters moved quickly until the judge looked toward Grace. "Mrs. Hayes, I notice there is no attorney seated with you this morning. Are you representing yourself?" Every eye in the courtroom shifted toward Grace. She slowly stood, offering the court a respectful nod before answering in a voice so calm it almost surprised the room. "Not at this time, Your Honor." The answer puzzled even the judge. Before another question could be asked, Sophia allowed herself a quiet laugh that carried farther than she intended. "Perhaps silence is the only argument she has left," she remarked softly enough to sound accidental, yet loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear. A few uneasy smiles appeared around the courtroom. Alexander lowered his eyes but said nothing. Grace simply returned to her seat without changing her expression. She did not defend herself. She did not challenge Sophia. She did not even look in her direction. Instead, she rested one hand lightly on a worn leather folder lying beside her chair, a folder so ordinary that no one bothered to wonder why she had carried it into court. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed that her fingers never left it for more than a moment, as though everything that truly mattered had already been placed safely inside long before the first witness would ever be called. Judge Eleanor Whitmore adjusted the papers before her and calmly reviewed the opening procedures while the courtroom settled into complete silence. Outside, the sounds of New York traffic drifted faintly through the tall courthouse windows, but inside every movement seemed magnified beneath the polished wooden ceiling. The court clerk confirmed attendance, legal filings, and procedural requirements before inviting the petitioner's attorney to begin. Richard Collins, one of Manhattan's most recognizable divorce attorneys, stood confidently and buttoned his navy suit jacket. His reputation had been built over 3 decades representing corporate executives, celebrities, and powerful families through highly publicized legal disputes. He approached the center of the courtroom with measured confidence and addressed the judge in a calm, persuasive voice. Your Honor, this case concerns the respectful conclusion of a marriage that has unfortunately reached its natural end. My client, Mr. Alexander Hayes, wishes to resolve these proceedings efficiently and fairly while avoiding unnecessary conflict. His presentation sounded polished, almost rehearsed, as he outlined property agreements, financial settlements, and proposed arrangements already prepared for the court's consideration. Every sentence emphasized cooperation. Every document suggested the outcome had already been carefully organized. Alexander remained expressionless beside him, occasionally glancing toward the judge but never once looking across the aisle. Sophia Bennet, seated only a few feet away, listened with unmistakable satisfaction. She occasionally exchanged quiet smiles with Richard Collins whenever another favorable point appeared in the presentation. To anyone unfamiliar with the case, the proceedings appeared almost routine. Grace still had not spoken. She remained seated exactly as before, one hand resting gently upon the worn leather folder beside her chair while quietly observing every word, every expression, and every reaction unfolding around the courtroom. Several journalists continued making notes, puzzled by her complete silence. One legal correspondent quietly whispered that perhaps Grace intended to accept the proposed settlement without objection. Another wondered whether emotional exhaustion had simply overcome her. Neither explanation reflected reality. Judge Whitmore eventually looked toward the respondents' table once again. Mrs. Hayes, she said kindly, you have the right to address the court regarding the petition and the proposed settlement. Would you like to respond before we continue? The entire courtroom turned toward Grace. She slowly lifted her eyes and stood with graceful composure. Her voice remained remarkably steady. Not yet, Your Honor. A ripple of quiet confusion moved through the spectators. The answer was respectful, but strangely incomplete. Judge Whitmore studied Grace for a brief moment before nodding. Very well. Grace returned to her seat without another word. Sophia could no longer hide her confidence. Leaning slightly toward Alexander, she whispered just loudly enough for nearby reporters to overhear, she has had months to prepare. If this is all she has, today will be over before lunch. Alexander offered no response. Instead, he looked briefly toward Grace, noticing for the first time that despite everything happening around her, she showed no signs of panic. There was no trembling in her hands. No hurried breathing. No desperation. Only patience. Something about that quiet certainty unsettled him in a way he could not explain. At the opposite end of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors remained closed, their polished brass handles reflecting the morning light streaming through the hallway outside. Grace glanced toward those doors for only a single second before lowering her eyes once again to the leather folder resting beside her. Hidden inside were neatly organized documents, carefully protected beneath simple dividers that had been prepared long before anyone inside the courtroom believed this hearing would ever take place. She closed the folder gently and rested both hands upon it, almost as though she already knew the most important person in the courtroom had not yet arrived. The quiet rhythm of the courtroom continued as Richard Collins methodically presented financial statements, property records, and carefully organized settlement proposals across the polished counsel table. Each exhibit reinforced the same impression that had already spread through the gallery. The marriage was over. The remaining question seemed to be how quickly the paperwork could be completed. Judge Eleanor Whitmore listened attentively while making occasional notes, interrupting only to clarify legal language or confirm procedural details. Every response from Richard reflected years of courtroom experience, delivered with the calm precision of a man who believed the outcome was already within reach. Grace remained completely still. She neither objected nor reacted when documents describing the division of homes, investments, charitable foundations, and corporate shares were placed into evidence. The silence surrounding her gradually became its own form of mystery. Reporters who had expected emotional testimony instead found themselves writing about the unusual composure of the woman everyone believed had the most to lose. Several spectators quietly exchanged uncertain glances, wondering whether she had truly accepted every condition without resistance. Across the aisle, Sophia Bennett interpreted the silence very differently. She leaned back comfortably, crossing one leg over the other with quiet satisfaction before whispering another remark toward Alexander. She knows there is nothing left to fight for. This time Alexander heard every word, yet instead of agreement he felt an unexpected sense of discomfort. He had spent months convincing himself that Grace would eventually challenge every accusation, question every decision, and transform the divorce into a public battle. Instead she had done the exact opposite. Her calmness felt strangely unfamiliar. It reminded him of the woman he had first met nearly 13 years earlier, long before board meetings, private jets, and financial television interviews became routine parts of their lives. Back then Grace had never spoken simply to fill silence. She had always waited until she had something meaningful to say. Judge Whitmore eventually turned another page in the case file before looking once again toward the respondents' table. "Mrs. Hayes," she asked with genuine patience, "before the court proceeds further, I want to ensure you fully understand your opportunity to present evidence, call witnesses, or contest the proposed settlement. Do you wish to exercise any of those rights at this time?" Every conversation in the courtroom ceased immediately. Grace slowly rose from her chair, keeping one hand resting lightly upon the worn leather folder. She looked respectfully toward the judge before answering with quiet confidence. "Yes, Your Honor." Richard Collins prepared to object, assuming she was finally ready to dispute the settlement. Sophia smiled, convinced the emotional confrontation she had anticipated from the beginning was finally about to unfold. Instead Grace calmly added only 4 words. "Just not yet." The answer lingered in the room far longer than anyone expected. Judge Whitmore observed her carefully, searching for uncertainty but finding none. Grace's expression revealed neither fear nor hesitation. It reflected preparation. The judge slowly nodded. "Very well, Mrs. Hayes. The court will continue." As Grace returned to her seat, she glanced once more toward the heavy wooden courtroom doors. This time her eyes remained there slightly longer. Alexander quietly followed her gaze without understanding why. Nothing happened. The doors remained closed. Yet something about Grace's unwavering confidence planted an uncomfortable question deep inside his mind. For the first time since entering the courthouse that morning, he no longer felt certain he understood everything waiting to unfold before the day came to an end. The morning session continued with quiet precision as Judge Eleanor Whitmore reviewed additional motions and financial disclosures submitted by Richard Collins. Every page seemed carefully prepared to reinforce a single conclusion that had already settled over the courtroom like an invisible verdict. Alexander Hayes had fulfilled his financial obligations. The proposed settlement appeared generous by every measurable standard. Expensive homes, investment accounts, charitable contributions, and long-term financial security had all been outlined with remarkable detail. To nearly everyone watching from the gallery, the case no longer resembled a complicated legal battle. It looked like a carefully managed conclusion. Richard Collins walked confidently toward the evidence monitor and displayed another series of exhibits documenting the couple's marital assets. "Your Honor," he said with practiced composure, "my client has made every reasonable effort to ensure fairness. We respectfully request that the court recognize the comprehensive nature of these agreements and proceed accordingly." Judge Whitmore nodded thoughtfully while reviewing the digital files. "The court acknowledges the documentation." Across the aisle, Grace remained quietly seated. Her posture never changed. She neither reached for the microphone nor interrupted the presentation. The worn leather folder still rested beneath her fingertips, its corners softened by years of careful use. Reporters continued watching her with growing curiosity. One journalist quietly remarked that she seemed less like someone losing a case and more like someone patiently waiting for the correct moment to begin one. Sophia Bennett noticed the whispers and smiled with renewed confidence. Leaning slightly forward, she addressed the courtroom loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear while pretending to speak only to Alexander. "Some people mistake silence for dignity," she said with a faint laugh. "Sometimes it is simply surrender." A few uncomfortable glances spread across the gallery. Judge Whitmore briefly looked toward Sophia, reminding everyone through a single measured expression that courtroom decorum mattered. Sophia immediately straightened in her chair, although the confident smile never fully disappeared. Alexander remained silent, but something inside him shifted. Grace had endured every unnecessary remark without responding once. That was not the behavior of someone overwhelmed. It was the discipline of someone protecting something far more important than pride. The realization unsettled him. He remembered countless negotiations where experienced executives remained silent until every assumption had been placed on the table. Only then did they reveal the one fact capable of changing everything. He looked again toward Grace and noticed that she had quietly checked the large courtroom clock mounted above the judge's bench. 10:37 in the morning. Her eyes then returned to the closed wooden doors at the rear of the courtroom before calmly settling back on the leather folder. She almost appeared to be following a schedule known only to herself. Judge Whitmore closed another file before addressing Grace once more. Mrs. Hayes, the court has now reviewed the petitioner's primary evidence. If you intend to present counsel or documentary evidence, I encourage you to notify the court promptly so we may proceed efficiently. Grace slowly stood once again, offering the judge the same respectful composure she had shown throughout the morning. Thank you, Your Honor, she answered. My counsel is aware of the schedule. The statement immediately caught everyone's attention. Richard Collins frowned slightly. Alexander looked toward the courtroom entrance almost instinctively. Even Sophia's confident expression softened into brief uncertainty. The courtroom doors remained closed for another long moment, but for the first time since the hearing began, the confidence inside the petitioner's table no longer felt absolute. Somewhere beyond those heavy wooden doors, someone was approaching, and Grace Hayes already knew exactly who it was. The words "my counsel is aware of the schedule" lingered in the courtroom long after Grace quietly resumed her seat. Judge Eleanor Whitmore glanced toward the rear entrance with calm curiosity before returning to the docket in front of her. Richard Collins adjusted his glasses, masking his uncertainty behind years of courtroom discipline, yet even he could not ignore the unusual confidence in Grace's voice. Alexander Hayes remained motionless, his attention divided between the judge's bench and the closed wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. Sophia Bennett, however, quickly recovered her composure. She leaned back comfortably and offered a faint smile that suggested she had already dismissed Grace's statement as another attempt to delay the inevitable. Perhaps her attorney got lost in Manhattan traffic, she murmured with a quiet laugh intended only for Alexander, although several nearby reporters heard every word. This time no one joined her amusement. Something in the atmosphere had changed. The certainty that had filled the room only minutes earlier had slowly given way to quiet anticipation. Judge Whitmore reviewed the court calendar before speaking. The court will allow a brief recess of 5 minutes before proceeding with the respondent's presentation. The bailiff acknowledged the instruction, and conversations immediately spread through the gallery as journalists hurried to update editors waiting outside. Reporters debated possible explanations. Some believed Grace had hired an inexperienced attorney who had simply arrived late. Others speculated that she had decided to negotiate privately at the last moment. None of them considered another possibility entirely. Grace remained seated while everyone around her became increasingly restless. She gently opened the worn leather folder for the first time that morning. Inside rested neatly organized documents divided by carefully labeled tabs, each page perfectly aligned as though prepared weeks earlier. She quietly confirmed that every section remained exactly where it belonged before closing the folder once again. Her expression never changed. Across the aisle, Alexander noticed the precise way she handled every document. He suddenly remembered evenings years earlier when Grace prepared legal briefs during law school, refusing to leave even the smallest detail unchecked before entering a courtroom. She had always believed preparation created confidence. Watching her now, he realized that same discipline had never disappeared. The courtroom door suddenly opened, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had no reason to hurry. Every conversation stopped almost instantly. An older gentleman with neatly combed silver hair entered wearing a perfectly tailored dark navy suit and carrying a well-used leather briefcase. His posture reflected decades of experience rather than pride. He acknowledged the bailiff with a courteous nod before walking calmly toward the respondent's table. Several attorneys seated in the gallery immediately recognized him. Their reactions were almost identical. One after another, they quietly stood as a sign of professional respect. Richard Collins looked up and, for the first time that morning, genuine surprise crossed his face. Even Judge Whitmore allowed herself the slightest expression of recognition before offering a polite smile. The distinguished attorney stopped beside Grace and placed his briefcase gently on the counsel table. Grace rose to greet him with quiet gratitude. Without exchanging unnecessary words, he nodded once and opened the briefcase, revealing neatly organized case files prepared with remarkable precision. The name engraved on a small brass plate attached to the leather case caught Alexander's attention immediately. Michael Turner. The attorney whose courtroom victories had become required reading in law schools across the country. The attorney who had spent 4 decades representing constitutional, corporate, and family cases with extraordinary success. Sophia's confident smile disappeared completely. For the first time since entering the courthouse, she understood that Grace Hayes had never arrived alone. She had simply waited until the right moment for the entire courtroom to discover it. The courtroom remained unusually quiet as everyone resumed their seats after the brief recess. The atmosphere no longer carried the confidence that had filled the room earlier that morning. Instead, it carried curiosity. Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked toward the respondent's table and offered a respectful nod to the distinguished attorney who had just arrived. "Good morning, Mr. Turner," she said. "The court recognizes your appearance on behalf of Mrs. Hayes." Michael Turner rose with calm professionalism. "Good morning, Your Honor. Thank you for accommodating my arrival. I apologize for the brief delay. I was concluding proceedings before the United States Court of Appeals." His voice was steady, warm, and completely free of theatrics. Every word reflected the confidence of a man who had spent 4 decades earning the respect now visible throughout the courtroom. Judge Whitmore acknowledged the explanation before instructing the clerk to officially enter his appearance into the record. Richard Collins quietly watched from across the aisle, carefully studying the attorney now standing opposite him. They had crossed paths only a handful of times during their careers, and Richard understood exactly what Michael Turner's presence meant. Grace Hayes had not hired an ordinary divorce attorney. She had retained one of the most respected litigators in the country. Alexander Hayes slowly leaned back in his chair, unable to hide his surprise any longer. He remembered reading several landmark legal opinions authored after arguments presented by Michael Turner during his own graduate studies in business law. His company had even consulted Turner's legal publications while developing corporate governance policies years earlier. Yet somehow, Grace had managed to retain him without Alexander hearing a single rumor. Sophia Bennett looked from Michael Turner to Grace with growing uncertainty. The confidence that had carried her through the entire morning quietly faded as she realized this hearing was no longer unfolding according to the story she had imagined. Michael calmly opened his leather briefcase and removed several neatly organized binders. Each contained color-coded tabs, indexed exhibits, and certified copies of legal records prepared with meticulous precision. Grace quietly slid the worn leather folder toward him. He accepted it with a grateful nod before placing it beside his own materials. The older folder looked modest compared to the polished binders surrounding it, yet Michael rested one hand upon it with unmistakable care, as though it contained something especially important. Judge Whitmore reviewed the updated docket before speaking. "Mr. Turner, are you prepared to proceed?" Michael smiled politely. "Yes, Your Honor." He paused briefly before adding, "Mrs. Hayes has been prepared for many months." The statement caused several reporters to exchange immediate glances while hurriedly updating their notes. Alexander lowered his eyes, quietly replaying the previous months in his mind. Throughout every difficult conversation, every cancelled dinner, every uncomfortable silence, Grace had never threatened litigation, never raised her voice, and never attempted to embarrass him publicly. She had simply listened. Now he wondered whether those quiet months had not been surrender at all, but careful preparation guided by patience rather than emotion. Michael approached the center of the courtroom with only a slim legal pad in his hand. He did not begin by arguing. He did not criticize the opposing side. Instead, he looked respectfully toward Judge Whitmore and said, "Your Honor, before presenting a single exhibit, the respondent requests permission to establish one simple fact. This case is not about the value of property. It is about the value of truth. Once that distinction becomes clear, every document that follows will speak for itself." Judge Whitmore gave a thoughtful nod. Permission granted. Grace remained seated behind her attorney with the same composed expression she had carried since entering the courthouse that morning. For the first time, however, she no longer looked like a woman waiting for her chance to speak. She looked like someone who had already spoken months ago through careful preparation, and whose voice was finally about to be heard through the evidence she had trusted someone else to present. Michael Turner stood quietly before the bench, allowing the silence to settle before opening the first binder. He did not rush toward dramatic conclusions or emotional arguments. Instead, he removed a single certified document and handed it to the court clerk, who immediately delivered copies to Judge Eleanor Whitmore and Richard Collins. The courtroom remained completely still as the judge reviewed the first page. "Your Honor," Michael began calmly, "the respondent is not asking this court to speculate about motives or intentions. We are asking the court to examine verified records that establish an accurate timeline." Judge Whitmore nodded. "Proceed." Michael turned one page. Exhibit 1 consists of certified corporate governance records, notarized correspondence, and dated financial disclosures covering the past 18 months. Richard Collins accepted his copy with professional courtesy, though the slight tightening of his expression suggested he had not expected these particular documents. Alexander watched quietly as the binders were distributed. Something about the dates immediately caught his attention. They reached much further back than the beginning of the divorce proceedings. Michael continued. "These records demonstrate that Mrs. Hayes requested multiple private meetings concerning governance issues affecting both the Hayes Family Trust and Hayes Global Holdings." He paused before adding, "Every request was documented. Every request received a response. Many of those responses came from executive offices rather than from Mr. Hayes personally." Alexander slowly lowered his eyes. He remembered seeing meeting requests forwarded by assistants during months consumed by acquisitions, investor conferences, and international travel. He had assumed they involved routine administrative matters and delegated them without reading the accompanying memoranda. Grace had never complained afterward. She had simply accepted the postponed conversations and quietly continued documenting each attempt. Michael carefully displayed another document on the courtroom monitor. It contained a timeline rather than accusations. Every entry listed only dates, meeting requests, written recommendations, and official responses. Nothing more. Nothing less. Judge Whitmore studied the exhibit with visible interest. "These records appear unusually comprehensive." Michael inclined his head respectfully. "Mrs. Hayes believed that important conversations deserved accurate records, Your Honor." Sophia Bennett shifted uneasily in her chair. She had expected passionate testimony, emotional confrontations, perhaps even angry accusations. Instead, every piece of evidence appeared calm, organized, and independently verified. There was nothing sensational to challenge. Only facts arranged with remarkable discipline. Richard Collins finally rose. "Your Honor, while these documents may establish communication history, they do not necessarily affect the proposed settlement." Michael responded before returning to his table. Standing alone, perhaps not. He rested one hand lightly upon Grace's worn leather folder. However, these documents were never intended to stand alone. The statement lingered throughout the courtroom. Grace remained quietly seated behind him, her expression unchanged. She neither celebrated nor reacted as the first pieces of evidence entered the official record. She simply watched the proceedings unfold exactly as they had been prepared months earlier. Alexander looked toward her with growing uncertainty. He suddenly realized that throughout their entire marriage Grace had never relied upon the volume of her voice to make herself understood. She relied upon preparation, patience, and truth. Michael opened the worn leather folder for the first time, revealing carefully preserved letters, signed memoranda, and neatly labeled dividers that had clearly been organized long before the hearing was scheduled. He selected only one sealed envelope, holding it gently before addressing the court once again. "Your Honor," he said, "before this hearing moves any further, the respondent requests permission to introduce the first document that explains why Mrs. Hayes remained silent this entire morning." Judge Whitmore looked directly at the sealed envelope before answering in a calm voice. "Permission is granted. The court is prepared to review the evidence." Michael Turner accepted the court clerk's permission with a respectful nod before carefully opening the sealed envelope. He removed a single handwritten letter protected inside a transparent archival sleeve and placed copies before Judge Eleanor Whitmore, Richard Collins, and the witness clerk. The paper showed no dramatic markings, no colorful annotations, and no emotional language. It appeared remarkably ordinary. Michael waited until everyone finished reading the heading before speaking. "Your Honor, this letter was written 18 months ago and delivered by certified mail. Its authenticity has been verified, and its chain of custody has been stipulated in advance." Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses and quietly reviewed the first paragraph. Her expression remained neutral, although her attention became noticeably sharper. Michael continued. "The letter documents Mrs. Hayes' formal request for a confidential meeting regarding governance concerns affecting both the Hayes Family Trust and the long-term reputation of Hayes Global Holdings. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was an invitation to resolve serious concerns privately before they ever reached a courtroom." Alexander stared at the copy placed before him. The signature at the bottom belonged unmistakably to Grace. He slowly remembered receiving notice from his executive assistant that a certified letter had arrived during a week filled with international travel and merger negotiations. Believing it concerned routine trust administration, he had instructed his legal department to review it instead. He had never opened it himself. Michael gently displayed another exhibit on the courtroom monitor. It contained delivery confirmations, acknowledgement receipts, and internal routing records demonstrating exactly where the letter traveled after arriving at Hayes Global Holdings. Every date matched the timeline already introduced into evidence. Nothing had been hidden. Nothing had been altered. Grace had simply been ignored. Sophia Bennett shifted uneasily in her chair before finally raising her voice. "Your Honor, this still proves nothing more than correspondence." Her interruption echoed briefly through the courtroom. Judge Whitmore looked toward her with measured patience. "Miss Bennett, you are not counsel in these proceedings. Please allow the attorneys to address the court." Sophia quietly nodded, though the confidence she had carried throughout the morning continued slipping away. Michael waited respectfully before speaking again. "The respondent agrees that one letter proves very little by itself." He opened another section of the worn leather folder. "That is precisely why Mrs. Hayes preserved every related communication." One by one, additional documents appeared on the courtroom monitor. Follow-up meeting requests. Governance memoranda. Written recommendations regarding executive reputation. Internal policy proposals. Every document carried verifiable dates and official acknowledgments. None contained emotional accusations. Each reflected careful professionalism. Richard Collins slowly turned each page, saying nothing. The consistency of the record made immediate objection difficult. Alexander felt an unexpected weight settle across his shoulders. As he studied the exhibits, he realized that Grace had spent months attempting to protect not only their marriage but also the reputation of the company they had built together. She had chosen private conversations over public conflict every single time. Michael closed the final binder before looking respectfully toward the bench. "Your Honor, these documents establish only one conclusion. Mrs. Hayes did not arrive in this courtroom because she failed to communicate. She arrived because every sincere effort to communicate was postponed until there was nowhere left to speak except here." The courtroom remained silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Grace looked quietly toward the judge without satisfaction or triumph. She had never wanted the record to embarrass anyone. She had only wanted the truth to exist where assumptions had once stood, and for the first time that morning, every person inside the courtroom began to understand why she had chosen patience instead of argument. Michael Turner waited until the courtroom settled into complete silence before returning to the center podium. He placed the worn leather folder on the polished counsel table and carefully removed one final indexed binder that appeared newer than the others. Unlike the earlier exhibits documenting unanswered correspondence and governance concerns, this binder contained certified legal agreements, engagement records, and court filings bearing official seals from multiple jurisdictions. Judge Eleanor Whitmore accepted the first document from the clerk and quietly reviewed the opening page. Richard Collins did the same, his expression becoming noticeably more serious with each passing line. Alexander Hayes leaned forward, unable to ignore the growing significance of the evidence now entering the record. Michael spoke with the same measured confidence that had defined every word since his arrival. Your Honor, opposing counsel has understandably assumed that Mrs. Hayes delayed seeking legal representation until these proceedings became unavoidable. The documentary record establishes the opposite. He gently turned toward the evidence monitor. Exhibit 21 is the executed engagement agreement retaining legal counsel. The document appeared on the courtroom screen. The date immediately captured everyone's attention. It had been signed nearly 11 months before the divorce petition was ever filed. A quiet wave of surprise moved through the gallery. Reporters hurried to compare the date with their earlier notes. The timeline changed everything. Michael continued. Mrs. Hayes retained my office long before any public announcement, long before media speculation, and long before today's hearing was ever scheduled. Judge Whitmore looked carefully at the certified signatures. The execution date appears properly notarized. It is, Your Honor, Michael replied. The agreement remained confidential because my client instructed our office to pursue reconciliation and private resolution before litigation. Court proceedings were always intended to be the final option, never the first. Alexander stared at the screen in disbelief. Nearly a year earlier, while he had been expanding overseas operations and attending investor conferences, Grace had quietly consulted one of the nation's most respected attorneys. Yet she had never threatened him with lawsuits, never leaked information to the press, and never attempted to gain leverage through publicity. Instead, she had continued requesting private conversations that he repeatedly allowed others to postpone. Sophia Bennett finally leaned forward, unable to remain silent. If she hired an attorney that long ago, then she must have been planning this from the beginning. Before anyone else could respond, Michael calmly answered without raising his voice. No, Miss Bennett. Planning to protect oneself is not the same as planning to destroy someone else. The courtroom became still once again. Michael placed another document before the judge. The engagement agreement includes written instructions from Mrs. Hayes directing our office to avoid unnecessary public filings, preserve the privacy of all parties whenever possible, and encourage negotiated solutions before initiating litigation. Judge Whitmore slowly read the paragraph aloud for the official record. Every sentence reflected restraint rather than revenge. Richard Collins quietly closed his copy of the document, recognizing that the narrative presented throughout the morning had fundamentally changed. Grace had not arrived prepared for a public battle. She had arrived prepared for every peaceful solution that had failed before the courtroom ever became necessary. Michael closed the binder and rested one hand upon the worn leather folder that Grace had carried since the hearing began. Your Honor, he said softly, the respondent remained silent this morning because she trusted evidence more than emotion. She did not need to defend her character through arguments. She had already preserved the truth through preparation. Alexander lowered his eyes toward the engagement agreement resting before him, finally understanding that the quiet woman sitting across the courtroom had spent nearly a year protecting both his dignity and the truth, even when no one realized she had already prepared for the day they would eventually stand before a judge. Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully placed the engagement agreement beside the earlier exhibits before looking toward Michael Turner with thoughtful attention. The courtroom had changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. The confident assumptions that had filled the morning had quietly disappeared, replaced by careful observation. Every person present now understood that Grace Hayes had entered the courthouse with a strategy built not upon surprise, but upon months of disciplined preparation. Michael returned to the counsel table and opened the final section of the worn leather folder. Unlike the previous documents, these papers carried the embossed seal of the Hayes family trust. The distinctive crest immediately caught Alexander's attention. He recognized it from estate planning meetings he had attended years earlier with his late father, although he had not seen those records in a very long time. Michael handed certified copies to the court clerk. Your Honor, the respondent now requests permission to introduce governance documents directly relevant to the proposed financial settlement. Judge Whitmore reviewed the request before nodding. Permission granted. The first document appeared on the courtroom monitor. It was not a dramatic contract or hidden financial record. It was an amendment to the Hayes family trust executed nearly 12 years earlier, only weeks after Alexander and Grace were married. Michael allowed several moments for everyone to read the heading before speaking. These provisions established long-term protections over specific family assets and charitable holdings. They were executed with the informed consent of both parties. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes stopping on the signatures at the bottom of the page. His own signature appeared beside Grace's, followed by the signatures of 2 trustees and a notary public. The memory returned gradually. His father had insisted that certain family assets remain permanently dedicated to charitable initiatives and employee foundations regardless of future business circumstances. At the time, Alexander had signed the documents without paying close attention to every provision, trusting both his father and Grace to understand the legal details. Michael calmly continued. The proposed settlement submitted this morning assumes unrestricted authority over several protected trust assets. The governing documents establish otherwise. Richard Collins immediately reviewed his copy more carefully, turning several pages before quietly adjusting his glasses. The oversight was not intentional. It had resulted from relying upon more recent corporate records rather than the original trust instruments. Judge Whitmore compared the documents side by side. The trust language appears clear. Michael respectfully nodded. Mrs. Hayes never challenged ownership for personal advantage. She simply requested that the original trust obligations be honored exactly as written. Alexander slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment. He finally understood why Grace had repeatedly requested private meetings over the past 18 months. She had not been attempting to preserve wealth for herself. She had been trying to prevent legal mistakes that could affect charitable foundations, employee scholarship programs, and family commitments established long before the divorce proceedings began. Sophia Bennett looked from one document to another with visible uncertainty. The financial future she had imagined now seemed far less certain than it had only a few hours earlier. Yet Grace never looked toward her. She remained focused entirely upon the judge and the legal process. Michael closed the trust binder before speaking once more. Your Honor, the respondent respectfully submits that this case has never been about obtaining more than she deserves. It has always been about protecting promises already made. The words settled quietly across the courtroom. Alexander looked toward Grace with growing humility, realizing that while he had measured success through acquisitions and expanding markets, she had quietly protected the commitments that gave those achievements meaning. At that moment he recognized a truth more valuable than any financial exhibit before the court. Grace had never been standing against him. She had been standing beside the promises they once made together, even after he had stopped remembering them. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully organized the final exhibits before her. Sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long reflections across the polished wooden floor while every person inside waited for the next development. The evidence no longer painted the simple story that had filled newspaper headlines throughout the previous weeks. Instead, it revealed a woman who had spent months attempting to preserve trust, protect legal obligations, and resolve private concerns without ever inviting public attention. Richard Collins slowly rose from the petitioner's table. His voice remained professional, but the certainty that had defined his earlier presentation had softened. Your Honor, after reviewing the newly admitted trust documents, the petitioner acknowledges that portions of the proposed settlement require revision to ensure full compliance with the Hayes family trust. Judge Whitmore nodded. The court appreciates counsel's candor. Alexander remained seated beside his attorney, saying nothing. His attention never left the documents resting before him. Every page reminded him of conversations he had postponed, responsibilities he had delegated, and promises he had assumed would somehow protect themselves without his attention. Across the aisle, Grace quietly folded her hands once again. She neither celebrated the changing direction of the proceedings nor looked toward Sophia Bennet. Her focus remained entirely upon the legal process. Sophia, however, could no longer remain composed. She leaned toward Richard Collins before speaking in a voice that carried farther than she intended. Surely none of this changes the fact that their marriage was already finished. Several reporters immediately looked up from their notebooks. Judge Whitmore calmly addressed her. Miss Bennet, this court is evaluating legal issues supported by evidence. Personal opinions are not evidence. Sophia hesitated before quietly lowering her eyes. Michael Turner stood once more. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I request that the respondent's final evidentiary summary be entered into the record. Proceed, the judge replied. Michael approached the evidence monitor and displayed a simple chronological chart. There were no dramatic graphics or emotional statements. The chart listed only verified dates. Requests for meetings. Certified letters. Governance recommendations. Trust amendments. Legal consultations. Every event had occurred before the divorce petition had ever been filed. This timeline demonstrates one consistent pattern, Michael explained. Mrs. Hayes repeatedly pursued private solutions before seeking judicial intervention. Litigation became necessary only after every documented effort at resolution had failed. Judge Whitmore reviewed the timeline carefully before turning toward Alexander. Mr. Hayes, do you dispute the authenticity of these records? Alexander slowly stood. The confidence that had once surrounded him had been replaced by thoughtful honesty. He looked at the exhibits one final time before answering quietly. No, Your Honor. The courtroom became completely still. I do not dispute them. Those 6 words carried more weight than hours of legal argument. Michael returned to his table without another comment. He had no need to press further. The evidence had already spoken with remarkable clarity. Grace looked briefly toward Alexander for the first time since the hearing began. There was no anger in her expression. No satisfaction. Only quiet compassion mixed with unmistakable disappointment. Alexander understood that look immediately. It was the same expression she had worn countless times throughout their marriage whenever she hoped he would slow down long enough to truly listen. Judge Whitmore closed the final binder before addressing both parties. The court has now received substantial documentary evidence establishing a significantly broader factual record than originally presented. The final determination will reflect that complete record rather than assumptions made before today's hearing. As her words settled across the courtroom, everyone present understood that the case had quietly shifted from a routine divorce proceeding into something far more meaningful. The truth had not arrived through dramatic accusations or emotional confrontation. It had arrived one carefully preserved document at a time, carried by a woman who believed preparation would always outlast pride. Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked across the courtroom with quiet deliberation before closing the final binder and folding her hands. The court will take a brief recess before issuing its preliminary findings, she announced. The wooden gavel sounded softly, and conversations immediately began spreading through the gallery as reporters hurried into the courthouse hallway to update their editors. Legal analysts who had entered the morning expecting an ordinary divorce hearing now found themselves discussing a very different story, one centered not upon wealth but upon preparation, responsibility, and credibility. Grace remained seated while Michael Turner quietly organized the documents back into the worn leather folder. Every exhibit returned to its original place with the same careful precision that had marked the entire hearing. You did exactly what you needed to do, Michael said gently. Grace smiled with quiet gratitude. The documents did what they were supposed to do. They told the truth. Michael nodded. Truth is always strongest when it does not need to raise its voice. Across the courtroom, Alexander stood near the tall windows overlooking the courthouse plaza below. Reporters waited outside behind security barriers, unaware that the greatest change taking place that day was happening inside him rather than inside the legal record. He watched Grace speaking quietly with Michael and suddenly remembered another courthouse many years earlier, where they had signed their marriage license with nothing more than two close friends and modest hopes for the future. There had been no television cameras then. No billion-dollar company. Only promises. He slowly walked across the courtroom until only a few feet separated him from Grace. Michael looked toward his client, and after receiving a small nod from her, quietly stepped away to give them privacy. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Finally Alexander broke the silence. I kept wondering why you never argued with me. Grace looked at him calmly. Because arguments only matter when both people are listening. Alexander lowered his eyes. I stopped listening a long time ago. Grace did not disagree. She simply waited. When I saw those letters today, he continued softly, I realized every opportunity to fix this existed before we ever entered this courthouse. I was just too busy convincing myself that success meant I could postpone everything else. Grace's expression remained gentle. Success never changes what matters. It only reveals what we choose to notice. Alexander took a slow breath. I thought today would be about dividing property. He looked toward the leather folder resting on the counsel table. Instead it became a record of every moment you tried to save what we had. Grace answered with complete honesty. I never prepared those documents to defeat you. I prepared them because I hoped I would never need to use them. The words settled quietly between them. Alexander looked directly into her eyes for the first time in many months. I am sorry, Grace. Not because the evidence proved I was wrong. Because I finally understand that you spent nearly a year protecting my dignity while I was too distracted to protect yours. Grace remained silent for several seconds before offering the smallest smile. An apology matters most when it is followed by different choices. Before Alexander could answer, the courtroom doors opened once again as the bailiff announced that proceedings would resume. Judge Whitmore returned to the bench while everyone resumed their seats. Grace quietly carried the worn leather folder back to the respondent's table, no longer as a shield against misunderstanding but as a reminder that truth patiently preserved would eventually speak for itself, and for the first time since the hearing began, Alexander no longer feared what the court might decide. He feared only the years he had spent overlooking the quiet strength of the woman sitting across from him. 1 year later, bright spring sunlight poured across the front steps of the newly opened Hayes Family Legal Resource Center in downtown Manhattan, where community leaders, young attorneys, nonprofit organizations, and local families gathered to celebrate a project few people could have imagined on the day the courthouse hearing first began. The elegant limestone building stood only a few blocks away from the courthouse where months earlier quiet documents had changed countless assumptions. Now its entrance welcomed anyone seeking affordable legal guidance, family mediation, and educational programs focused on responsible governance and conflict resolution. A simple bronze plaque rested beside the front doors. It read, Truth deserves preparation. Compassion deserves patience. Alexander Hayes stood greeting guests without the formal distance that had once defined his public appearances. Employees from Hayes Global Holdings noticed how different he had become during the past year. He attended governance meetings personally, answered difficult questions instead of delegating them, and restored the regular trust reviews his father had once considered essential. The company had recovered, investors had regained confidence, and the charitable foundations protected by the Hayes Family Trust continued expanding their scholarships and community partnerships. Yet Alexander no longer described those achievements as his greatest success. Grace Hayes arrived carrying the same worn leather folder she had held throughout the courthouse hearing. Time had softened its edges even more, but she still treated it with quiet care. Alexander smiled as she approached. "You still keep it with you," he said warmly. Grace laughed gently. "It reminds me that preparation is never about winning. It is about protecting what matters." They entered the center together, where a group of law students waited around a polished conference table. Michael Turner, now serving as senior advisor to the foundation, welcomed everyone before placing a single document in front of Alexander and Grace. It was not a settlement agreement, a trust amendment, or a courtroom exhibit. It was the official charter establishing permanent funding for free legal education and family mediation services throughout New York. Michael quietly slid an elegant fountain pen across the table. "I believe this belongs to both of you." Alexander looked at Grace before picking up the pen. "A year ago we signed documents because we feared losing everything." Grace nodded softly. "Today we sign because we finally understand what is worth keeping." Together they signed the charter while students and community volunteers applauded with genuine appreciation. No television cameras crowded the room. No dramatic headlines waited outside. The moment belonged entirely to the people whose lives would benefit from the work beginning that afternoon. After the ceremony concluded, Alexander and Grace walked slowly through the center, stopping to speak with families seeking guidance and young attorneys beginning public service careers. Before leaving, they paused beside the bronze plaque near the entrance. Alexander reached gently for Grace's hand, and this time she accepted it without hesitation. There was no need for grand promises. The choices they made every day had already become those promises. As they stepped into the warm afternoon sunlight together, the worn leather folder rested quietly beneath Grace's arm, no longer carrying evidence meant for a courtroom but the founding charter of a place built to help others resolve conflict before silence became separation. The greatest victory had never been the legal outcome, the protected trust, or the restored reputation. It was the simple decision to let truth guide justice, to let humility rebuild trust, and to remember that the strongest partnerships are not preserved by wealth or power, but by listening before it is too late.